Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming and spending some time with us here this morning to hear Donald Shoup speak. And welcome to all the online attendees that we have as well. Just so you know, as you've probably noticed in the background there, the session is being recorded. The recorded session is going to be posted online on the same page that you used to register for the event today. And it should be up in a few weeks. Dr. Shoup has requested we just wait to the end for questions. He's got a lot of stuff to go through, and there'll be time at the end for some questions. So I should start. My name's Glenn Furtado, the GM of the Calgary Parking Authority, and we're very pleased here to be hosting Donald Shoup come talk to us today about parking and share with us his experiences in the industry. The Calgary Parking Authority, this aligns perfectly with our strategic pillars, innovating to improve, planning for the future, and meeting the parking needs in the communities we serve. So this is just one little initiative that we're really proud to host and sponsor here. There's opportunities to win one of Donald Shoup's books here today. We have a hashtag ShoupInYYC, so please feel free to use that. Also, you could post questions on there. Chelsea will be moderating some questions at the end if there's an opportunity. So look to that on social media. Some other things that are going on at the CPA right now, we're holding two design competitions for a couple of surface lots. There's one in Kensington and one in Inglewood. One is for the public and professionals, and the other one is being done in conjunction with the University of Calgary, the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape. And our partners at CMLC are actually helping us out with that one, so if you're interested in learning more about that, you could look on their website. We also hosted a very successful sponsorship program this year. So Chelsea and some others on the team basically vetted applications to support parking, to support transportation, mobility, a variety of projects throughout our city. And it's been very successful. The project's wrapping up on October 23rd. And it's going to wrap with a celebration lunch. And if you're interested in attending, learn more about some of the submissions and some of the projects that have been funded through that program, you can email sponsorships@calgaryparking.com for more information. And of course, we're close to our new 9th Avenue Parkade across from the library. So that project, we're very proud of that one as well. It's a partnership with CMLC and Platform for an innovation center. And it's transformational in terms of parking as well, so that there's some neat things there. It's slated for completion. We hope to welcome our new customers there by the end of 2020 or early 2021. So Donald Shoup is a distinguished research professor in the Department of Urban Planning at the University of California, Los Angeles. His research has focused on how parking policies affect cities, the economy, and the environment. Shoup is a fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners and an honorary professor at the Beijing Transportation Research Center. The American Planning Association gave Shoup the National Excellence Award for a planning pioneer, and the American Collegiate Schools of Planning gave him the Distinguished Educator Award. Recently, the Wall Street Journal has called Donald Shoup a parking rock star and the Yoda of urban planning. So without further ado, Donald Shoup.
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. I was pleased when the Wall Street Journal called me a parking rock star, but I know that's not the same thing as a real rock star, although I have thought of changing my name to Shoup Dog. And I was honored to be called the Yoda of urban planning until I remembered from Star Wars that Yoda was 800 years old. I've never been to Calgary before, and I like it a lot. Yesterday, my wife was with me, and I asked her, in your wildest dreams, did you ever think I would be invited to speak to you about parking in Calgary? And she said, you're not in my wildest dreams. Here's a picture of parking in Silicon Valley. And I think too much of North America looks like this view, and we tend to ignore this asphalt blight, especially when we're parked free in it, as all of these cars are on a weekday. But parking is only free to us in our role as a motorist. because we pay for parking dearly in all other aspects of our lives, as a tenant or as a landlord, as an employee, as an employer, as a shopper, as a taxpayer. The cost of parking doesn't go away just because the driver doesn't pay for it. And I think any sensible discussion of parking reform cannot ignore the off-street parking requirements that create this picture. And here's an even larger picture. This is the campus, as they call it, of Cisco Systems. You even wonder what would be the address of these buildings. Why are the buildings in the middle of the parking lots? Well, because that minimizes the distance walking from your car to the office building. Why does Silicon Valley look this way? It's because the cities require it. Here are the parking requirements in San Jose, which is the city where Cisco is located. And the green bar is 1,000 square feet of the building. The red bar is the size of the required parking lot. Why are they so high? Why are they exactly those numbers? I suppose dancing and skating are similar, I suppose, so they might have similar parking requirements. Everybody has to shop, and that they eventually die, we have to have parking requirements for everything from birth to death. And in between, you have to have your animals groomed. I mean, really, nothing can be built unless there's a minimum parking requirement for it, so the developer will know how much to provide. Well, Calgary has similar parking requirements. It seems to require a lot of parking for anything that's fun. And the parking requirements are weirdly precise, as though somebody knows what they're doing. Calgary requires 2.85 parking spaces for every 10 square meters of a drinking establishment. Well, why is it that? And I'm sure if you asked in City Hall, nobody could tell you why it's that. But each parking space is about 30 square meters when you include the aisles for the access. At Calgary requires 2.85 spaces per 10 meters of drinking space. So you can see why if each parking space is 30 square meters, you're requiring so much more parking than you are allowing for the building. Calgary seems to want everyone to drink and drive. And when you look at it from the air, you could selectively find parts of Calgary that have an awful lot of parking and not much greenery. It really looks very auto-oriented if you selectively look at it from the air. But these parking requirements they're so elaborate. There's one for every land use in Calgary. So you think that people, they've been studying this, and they know what they're doing. That it's sort of scientific. That like the periodic table of the elements. For every element, we know what their atomic weight is, and so for every land use, we know what the parking requirement is. But planners are winging it, and parking requirements are closer to sorcery than to science. And they're a fertility drug for cars. Well, I think you can find lots of interesting quotes on parking requirements. Here far back as 1944, the Los Angeles County Planning Commission concluded that cities should require each building to provide at least as much space for cars as there is for floor area for stores or people. But we've learned a lot since 1944. Here's another view of minimum parking requirements. And it's closer to my view, I would say. The reason I think this is by looking at where these parking requirements come from. If you're a planner, just like you're a young planner, and the city council wants you to set the parking requirements for a nail salon or an animal grooming studio or something, what are you going to do? You didn't learn anything about it in planning school because the professors have nothing to teach about parking requirements. They don't know anything about them. The only thing you learn about parking requirements as a planning student is they get in the way of everything you want to do. You may have wanted to become a planner because you wanted to build affordable housing or green space or work for active transportation or public transport or something like that. And everything you want to do is thwarted by minimum parking requirements. The title of this book is called Parking Standards. That sounds good, a good thing, like high standards are good, aren't they? But the report says nothing about standards. It doesn't say what parking requirements should be. It only reports the parking requirements from a small selection of cities. And here's just the first page for what there were 606. This was the most recent one, 660 uses. This is just from animal auction houses, I think, the boarding houses. So there are 8 other pages in the index of all of those things. Just like planners have known how many parking spaces for every single one of these land uses. And then you go to one of the pages. This is the first page, and we're in bad shape if this is what the American Planning Association thinks the U.S. should look like, is that there would have to be parking requirements for an adult theater or an adult bookshop, an adult massage parlor. How do the planners know all the different parking requirements for those adult uses, I wonder? And here's just a sample of parking requirements. They look simple when planners can link parking to people. Say, there has to be a space for the barber and for the person in the barber chair, I suppose. And that there are gender differences, which are unexplained. But they all seem to require at least one space per person, except for religious uses. And even then, there are gender distinctions. But after you get away from one space per person, what do? Then you have to go usually per 1,000 square feet, because that's easily measured. The planners want simple things that they can check on. And when you're applying for a new land use, that you know how many 1,000 square feet there are. But sometimes it gets more difficult. It isn't per 1,000 square feet. And it just has to be for everything. And you have to get very inventive with it. Even parking requirements for the afterlife. Well, the problem is that planners who are asked to set these parking requirements don't know a lot of the necessary information. They don't know how much the parking spaces required cost, and neither do you. Nobody in this room knows how much parking spaces cost because they depend very individually on the specific site, the geometry, the water table. If you have a triangular building, I can tell you a triangular parking lot is very expensive because there's a lot of waste space. And you don't know how much these parking requirements increase the cost of everything, or importantly, affect urban design. That at least in the United States, they really disfigure so many buildings, especially when they're podium buildings. So the first 5 floors are a parking garage, and then you get to build something on top of it. Or how do these parking requirements affect traffic congestion? You think that more cars would lead to more traffic and more air pollution and more fuel consumption. And on top of this, they have no training in how to set parking requirements. So I think really these parking requirements are politicizing what should be a business decision. That the businesses who are paying for the parking spaces should be the ones who know how many to build. And they're governmentalizing what should be private choices. I often hear complaints that charging for parking is the same thing as privatizing it, especially for curb parking. But the governments own the parking spaces, and they continue to manage it. And this is not privatization. No matter who owns it, it has to be managed. Well, can cities remove parking requirements? This is I think many, especially in the green section of society, we should get rid of parking requirements. Well, I think that we can. Zoning requires several homes for every car, but it ignores homeless people. And I think that by increasing the cost of housing, parking requirements make the homelessness problem even worse. In planning, free parking has become more important than affordable housing. How can we get out of the mess that we're in? Well, let's go back to Silicon Valley. Here's the parking lot that I showed you from the air. It's really very nice. It's a lovely area. It's a wonderful place to be if you're a car. What could this look like if we could convert some of it to housing? No, the building in this parking lot is as big as it can get, given the number of parking spaces it has. That's what limits the size of the building, is that how many parking spaces you can provide, because you have to have a certain number of parking spaces for every 1,000 square feet of building. Well, I was talking to the Congress of New Urbanism, and I took some buildings from the University of London, which must have been just recently cleaned. I said, well, you could build on the periphery of these parking lots. The New Urbanists call this liner housing. So you put, or liner buildings, you could put buildings around the perimeter of parking lots. So when you walk down the street, it looks like a real city. But behind it is a parking lot. So it wouldn't take up away much of the parking. And you could build this. It's all under one ownership. There's no land assembly. It doesn't have to be remediated, the soil or anything like that. You don't have to build underground parking. It's all already there. So it would be a lot cheaper, I think. But that is the kind of building that would be, that's from the University of London. That wouldn't be what would be built in Silicon Valley. So I just took some apartment buildings from downtown Los Angeles, very garden variety parking buildings with underground parking. That way you could put that on the perimeter. And they showed that how land devoted to parking could be developed as housing if cities removed the off-street parking requirements. And the employees who live in these buildings could just walk across the parking lot to work. And, of course, in Silicon Valley, they say there are these awful commutes and terrible high housing prices and awful congestion. So this would be a good alternative, I think. And building it without any parking would greatly reduce its cost. And you could share the parking between the offices and the houses. You'd have to start charging for the parking, of course, because there'd be much higher demand and actually less parking, but people should pay for parking, I believe. And if that worked out, just think how much more valuable the land would be if you can convert it from empty parking spaces into condominiums in a place, in an area where housing prices are so high. It could be subsidized, I suppose, for the employees who work in those buildings. And if it worked out, you could just continue doing it. It would be a pilot project. You just have to see how it works out. Once the city got out of the way, the city has to get out of the way by getting rid of the parking requirements. So here's the picture of the buildings in downtown LA. I think it's a school on the ground floor and apartments above. But it could be anything in these lighter buildings. It could even be garden apartments. It doesn't have to be an office building like that. So I think there are a lot of good effects of removing parking requirements and building this job-adjacent housing. Just consider the common complaints, the long commutes that would happen. That certainly building the housing would require a lot of labor. I mean, they can't be imported. You could build, just think if you were a plasterer or drywaller or a roofer or a plumber or an electrician or even a planner, I suppose, or an architect, that there would be a lot of jobs created by building on these parking lots. Certainly increase the housing supply. And the complaints about these 2-hour-long commutes would be addressed, I suppose. And we'd spend less on cars and fuel, which we now in California largely import. You can't import new housing, but you can import cars and fuel. and it would address a lot of the problems that we have. And for some conferences when I go to in the parking profession, I point out the fact that these parking lots employ nobody. There's no technology, there's no parking professionals involved in it, there's no license plate reading, there's no nothing. But if you started charging for parking, you'd have to manage it. And of course, it would, I think, you can't neglect the fact that it might be the city's contribution to slowing climate change. But I think that that's the icing on the cake, because the city ought to do all this for reasons that would exist even if there weren't any worries about climate change. So I recommend three policies to get to the parking reforms I'm talking about. So there are three things that if they done simultaneously, they would work together to make the whole thing operate. And then one is to charge the right price for curb parking. You can't get rid of off-street parking requirements unless you charge the right price for on-street parking. And by the right price, which is a tautology, I suppose, but who could object to the right price? But I mean the lowest price you could charge to still have one or two open spaces. If half the spaces are open, empty, the price is too high. If all the spaces are full, the price is too low. So I think what the driver wants to see is one open space wherever they go. That's ideal for the driver. They don't want 5 open spaces on the block, they want 1. And I've never heard anybody say they know a better way to set the price of parking. In fact, I've never heard anybody say they have any principle for setting the price of parking. So I'd say that it's very easy to just look at a block and say whether the price is just right or too high or too low. And then to make this politically popular, some American cities, and Calgary to a degree, spend the meter revenue in the neighborhoods that generate it. That revenue return will make the meters popular. Some cities offer free transit passes to everybody who works in a downtown business district that charges market prices for curb parking. Some cities give free Wi-Fi in the district. Some cities, Pasadena, California is the best example. They clean the sidewalks every night, and they steam clean them twice a month. They remove graffiti every night if it ever appears, which once they started removing it every night, none of it ever reappeared. And I suppose in Calgary, they could remove snow from the sidewalks. The extra money can be very important to say that if you have parking meters, you'll get the snow cleared off your sidewalks by 8 a.m. or something like that. And then after you've done these two, or at the same time you do them, you remove the off-street parking requirements. This will allow building owners to reuse their building as, for example, as a restaurant that requires 2.85 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet, even if they don't have any parking. The older buildings, historic buildings, will be much more reusable if there are no off-street parking requirements. So the demand-based prices, parking prices, that's charging the right price over time. They'll have to be different on different blocks and at different times of day, at different seasons. About 85% occupancy is the level that people recommend both for off-street parking and for off-street and off-street parking. That's sort of engineering sort of optimum of the occupancy rate. And it's the lowest price the city can charge and still want to leave one open space. Everybody will see that convenient parking is available, that they can't say there's not enough parking. If everywhere they go, they see 1 or 2 open parking spaces, how could you be so complaining about parking if you see 1 open space wherever you go? And it's a lot better than having all the spaces full. I think having no parking is much worse than paying for convenient parking. San Francisco was one of the first city that really went whole hog into this. They had a grant from the federal government. Unfortunately, it allowed them to hire a graphic artist to explain what was happening. They say, here's the problem that we have, is that on some blocks, all the spaces are occupied, and on other blocks, there's ample open spaces. So if you just nudge up the price on the crowded block and nudge it down on the bottom block, you could get this. Now, many people seem to think that charging fair market prices for curb parking would require some wrenching social change, almost as cataclysmic as the Reformation or Prohibition. You know, we can't handle it socially, but it's really very small. If you can't nudge up the price of parking on one block enough to move a car someplace else, what can the city do? If the city can't do this, if they say this is really too complicated or technically difficult or something like that, well, how can they do all the other more complicated things that they have to do? So the price is not too low, not too high, but just right. This comes from research done in a business district next to UCLA, where the prices were very low. Certainly, the curb parking was much cheaper than the off-street parking. And we estimated, and all the spaces were always full, and we estimated that on average, there were 2 cars circling every block, waiting for somebody to go out. But if you got the right price right, you'd get 1 or 2 open spaces on every block. You'd reduce a lot of traffic. So this was SF Park that did the first thing. They also were able to pay for a video to explain it. This explains in 2 minutes what it takes me an hour. Well, I'm afraid that they didn't get the sound right on this project. So could you, the video people, can you get the sound correct? Well, maybe you don't need the sound, you'll see it. I hope you would do it.
Finding a parking
The problem is that there are cars circling on every block, hunting for parking. And what could we do about this? They're polluting the air.
Some drivers just give up and double park. This clogs our streets and needlessly pollutes the air. These cars
They get these cruising cars hunting for parking. They block public transit, and emergency vehicles, and they make it difficult for bicyclists.
San Francisco is testing new
So
parking
what
technology and a
San
flexible
Francisco
approach to
did was
pricing
have this
that
new
is designed to make
technology of
parking
having
work better
sensors
for
in the
everyone.
blocks.
SF Park's goal is to have at least
In the
one
parking spaces so that
available per block.
they know whether the
That way,
spaces are
drivers
empty or
can park
not,
near a
and they
specific
raise the
destination
price up and
without the
down
need to circle
so
the
that
block or
whenever
the
you
This
when
also
somebody
provides
does
a
park,
steady
somebody
flow of
else will be
customers for business
leaving.
SF Park provides
So that
safer
there's
and
almost
clearer
always 1 or
streets
2
for
open
everyone.
spaces. It'd be safer for
Here's how it works.
bicycling.
Installed parking
And it depends
sensors
on these
detect when the parking
sensors
space is available.
that tell the
Drivers
city
will be able
what
to
is
check
the
parking
price of,
availability and rates
what is the
online
occupancy
by
rate.
text message
And they
or by
change the
smartphone
price
before
up
heading
or
to their
down
destination.
once
This will
every
help
3
people
months.
decide whether to
But
drive,
they
take
change it
public
up or
transit,
down on
bike,
each
or
block. And
When
for
people
different
choose
time
to
periods of the day, the
drive, new
morning
SF
and the
Park
midday
meters will make paying
and the
easier.
afternoon.
In addition
and-
to taking
and,
coins, the new
yes,
meters
the
will
afternoon.
accept credit cards and,
And
SFMTA
of course,
parking cards.
the
Parking
metering
time limits will be
technology is so
extended.
much easier. Even that is old-fashioned
enabled
now.
and
So much
extended
parking
time
is done by
limits will help
apps
drivers
that
avoid
you don't even
tickets.
have to get out of your car. And they do the
Prices at
same thing
city-owned
for the
parking
parking
garages will be
garages. They
adjusted to
adjust the
provide an
prices
attractive
up or down
alternative to meter
to
parking.
achieve an occupancy
Parking
rate
rates
that
will
the
be adjusted
that
based
the
on
that
demand
the
once a
the,
month,
the
never
city
by more than
council
50 cents.
doesn't make decisions
So
on
here
how
is where
much
it
parking
seems
should
nearly
cost.
impossible to
They
find a
let
parking
the
space.
demand
Rates
make the
will
decision.
increase until
So
at
here's
least
the
one
problem.
space is
So on that
available most of
the
the
one
time.
block where they're red,
And in
that
areas
the
where
price
open
would have
parking
to go
spaces are
up.
plentiful, rates will decrease until most
And
of
then
the
on
empty
this
spaces
block where
fill,
they're yellow
or until
cars, the
rates
price will
bottom
go
out
down
at as little as 25 cents
until
per
we
hour.
have just about
SF
1 or
Park
2
is
open
designed to
spaces on
ensure
every
that
block.
drivers easily find an open space near their
I'm
destination.
hoping the people back there are working hard
SF
on getting
Park will
this
help people plan
sound
ahead,
going because I'll
making
need it for
informed
other
decisions about the
videos as
best
well.
time and
So the surprising thing is, that surprised me and everybody else, is that the average prices declined with SF Park. That it really essentially stayed the same, but it unfortunately went down by about 1%. They had a maximum of $6 an hour. Very few blocks got that high, but many blocks fell to 25 cents an hour. Remember, they started out previously from a minimum of $2 an hour, and after the 10th rate change in 3 years, got down to 25 cents an hour. That's the lowest price that they charge, because so many blocks had been overpriced in the morning. And I think they should be free if there's empty spaces. And sales tax revenue increased in the test area compared to the nearby area that was used as the control group. That it was during the terrible recession, but the areas that had these variable prices actually got higher sales tax revenue. That's the measure of business success. Did the sales taxes go up or down? Now, many people think that, well, this is very difficult to do because how can the meters handle it? Here's a picture of the first parking meter in 1935 on the left, and that's your great-great-grandfather's parking meter. At least in the United States, most parking meters are still like that. You put the coin in, and you hope to get back before your time runs out. As that there was when the parking meters were new, people were horrified at them. They thought it was an infernal combination of a slot machine and an alarm clock. That if you didn't get back in time, you risked a ticket. But most parking meters are much more sophisticated than this. Here's one on the UCLA campus. Much of the technology, new technology in parking comes from Canada. These are made in Vancouver. But when you go to this, they made these specially at the request of West Hollywood in California. They want an old-fashioned looking parking meter, like a Mickey Mouse version of parking meter, not like these ATM machines that are most of the multi-space meters look like. But it doesn't tell you anything about the price of parking until you touch any button, and it tells you the price at that time. There are 4 different price schedules during the day. It's $3 for the first hour and $4 for the second hour. Now, that seemed like a lot to charge for students on campus. So I set up my camera across from the law school library, where there are 8 parking spaces governed by this parking meter. And usually there are about 8 parking spaces on parallel parking spaces on a city block. And this is what it should be. I think 1 open space, 1 out of 8 spaces is open. You can see somebody paying at the meter. And so I set my camera up there. I suppose some of you suspect that professors have a lot of spare time on their hands, and I did. So I set my camera up there and took a picture every 4 minutes to see what happened at this. So you can see that the 2 cars on the end never moved, because you could park for 2 hours. So here's the 4 minutes went by, and 1 car left, and another car came, which is what you want. Another 4 minutes later, 1 car left, and another car came. But still, if you were an arriving driver, this is what you would see. There was one time when there were no open spaces, but 4 minutes later, there was an open space. Sometimes there were more than one. But so every 4 minutes, you could see, sometimes there were 2 spaces, I think. Once there were 3 open spaces. That's the most it ever got. So I think this is probably the best you're going to get, because parking is very hard to predict. It's a highly variable thing. So you probably can't do better than this. And it isn't awful if this is the city, because if you just go to the next block, if all the space is full on 1 block, if you go to the next block and there's a space, that's okay, I think, or even 2 blocks. But I think this is really the right price. I don't think it should be higher because that means there would be a lot of vacant spaces and the students wouldn't be able to use them to go to the library or talk to professors or whatever they want to do. I don't think the price should be lower. If it were lower, then all the spaces would be full. Like before, previously, the students sometimes came to my office, well, only once, but she was in tears. And she had been waiting for parking spaces. Those same spaces, they're right near my office. And it's hard to know if you're waiting for a space, who's got priority. And so she was waiting for a space to open up, and somebody made a U-turn and went right into it and took it away from her. And she was so upset about this, she was in tears. So I think the right price for car parking is like the U.S. Supreme Court's definition of pornography, is I know it when I see it. That there's no way to say whether the price of parking is too high or too low, except by looking at the results. But that's all you need. There are no models. You don't have to hire consultants to tell you what the right price is, or experts. All you have to do is look. And I'm not saying that $3 an hour is the right price for parking. I'm saying that $3 an hour was the right price in that location at that time. And as I say, there are different prices at different times of day. So if you know it when you see it, if the city council lets go of the price of parking and says that it's up to the parking authority to set these prices, but any city councilman just can look out the window and say, did they get it right? It's the parking authority's responsibility to get the occupancy right. It is their ability to change the price of parking in response to changes in demand that allows them to make the parking system work. Washington, D.C. has started doing this. And here is an example of what it looks like at the beginning of the system. In 2017, the lower prices are blue and green, and the higher prices are pink and red. So it's amazing to think that you could get blocks so close to each other with such different prices. But that's happened in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Whenever you start charging according to demand, you get surprisingly different prices on nearby blocks. So the top panel is for the morning hours. It shows more blue and green blocks because the demand-based prices were lower in the morning. And the price is increased in midday in the bottom panel, so the map turns red. And many of the prices are tourists, and they're willing to pay for convenient parking on their visits to the city. They don't know what the price of parking is anyplace else unless they went on the web beforehand and looked at it. But you think that they're but if you were a savvy person, if you were somebody who went there all the time, you would realize that some blocks are cheaper than other blocks. Did you get the sound going right, Chelsea? Did they fix the sound?
We'll find out.
Okay, I see. And then here's the same prices, same area in 2019. And you can see how spread the prices are now because they only changed 25 cents an hour every 3 months. So it took quite a long time for some prices to get up to $6.50 an hour and others down to $1 an hour. And then they were all $2.30 an hour all day long before the demand pricing began. And here is a very clever graphic they did showing how after each price change, the range of prices spread wider and wider. They just had to keep reducing the price on some blocks and keep increasing it. All the other, that's all they can do. I think that what they could do is to inform people what these prices are. It's all on the web, of course, but if they just posted these maps like this and restaurant windows and things like that so that the regular customers would know, well, gee, if I park 3 blocks away, I'd only pay 75 cents an hour. I'll do that and I'll walk. Of course, you have to enforce these prices. If if you're going to start charging prices to manage demand, you have to make sure that people pay the prices. Here's a system in Manhattan for off-street parking, but the technology of parking payments and enforcement are vastly better now, and I know they are in Calgary. So I think the new parking technology has solved the practical problems of enforcement. The main problems are political. If everybody is paying the right price, then we'll get the right uses. The only way to get the right uses for the curb parking is to get the right prices. So, but how do you make it politically feasible to charge these high prices and to make sure that people are paying them? Well, one solution I would recommend for Calgary, I don't think it has it yet, is to have these progressive parking fines. Many cities have found that a large majority of all parking tickets are accumulated by a small minority of frequent violators. That you have to have a very high fine for violation in order to deter these repeat violators. And that creates a heavy burden on occasional violators. Say in Los Angeles, it would be $70 for a street sweeping violation. If your car is parked on the street, and when the street sweeper comes by, you get a $70 ticket, which is a lot of money for many people. For low-income people, $70 could be a day's wages. That is just too much. And that's why the enforcement is very lax in most cities. They don't cite all violations because that's politically difficult. It's a very bad way to raise revenue, is to have lax enforcement and high fines. Because whenever anybody gets a fine, they say, "Why me?" You know, the enforcement seems random, which it is. So some cities have got around this difficulty of strict enforcement by saying in a year the first violation is just a warning. It's on your windshield, and it says or sent to you by email or even by mail, I suppose, saying that you were illegally parked here, and this is your first offense, and you. Here's what the fines are for subsequent violations in this year. And it starts out low and it ends up high. So this is the way to deter repeat violators. And it would, anybody can make a mistake at a parking meter or no parking zone or something like that, I suppose. But if you do it once, you get a break. And this was especially good for customers from out of town and tourists who previously would have gotten a ticket for $70 and say, "I'll never come back here again." That they would realize that even in an area where most drivers are accustomed to free parking, cities can charge for parking without creating a lot of opposition. The many tickets for a few repeat offenders suggest that moderate fines do not deter drivers who view parking tickets as an acceptable gamble or just another cost of doing business. So I think that the right prices consistently enforced are very important and completely feasible. Well, I think all this information will help drivers get the best bargain. But parking wants to be paid for, that you won't get the right uses unless you're paying the right prices. Well, I think another reason we need the right prices is to avoid cruising for parking. Hunting around for a space being vacated when all the spaces are occupied. Here's a list of studies that I've unearthed of what share of the traffic is cruising for parking, or how long does it take to find a curb parking space, starting back in 1927. That's over 90 years ago. Probably it was done in Detroit. But this is in 4 continents and 21 studies and 13 cities. then on average, the research found that about a third of the cars in traffic were cruising for parking. It took about 7.5 minutes to find a space. Now, this does not represent all cities or any city in particular. This is people were looking to find cruising. They would only look for cruising in areas where they knew it was going on, because you've all done it, I'm sure. Everybody has done it. You know it happens. But if everybody else is doing it, it adds up to a lot of traffic. So if you do these measurements and find out what is the average amount of time people are spending cruising, and you say, well, that's true of all parkers in the area, well, maybe that gives you a better idea of how big the problem is. Here was an interesting study in a Chicago suburb before World War II, and they stationed students at every corner with stopwatch with watches, and they wrote down the license plate number of each car, and the exact time it passed, and whether it went straight ahead or turned left and right. So they were able to recreate the path of travel. And some, like on the upper left, some people, or upper right, some people were trying to see what would happen. I'll try another block. Other people, like on the lower left, were obsessive about the particular block where they wanted to park. So there's so many different strategies about parking. Here's the results of a study in Zurich, which is famous for having the best transportation policies of any big city of the world. And it shows the share of on-street parking spaces that are vacant in every hour on a weekday. So they're all full from about 11 to 4. So there are plenty of vacancies until you reach 11, and then predictably, they're all full until 4 p.m. And they were able to measure the average search time before parking. So you can see that when they're empty spaces, nobody is cruising for parking. It doesn't take long. But when they're all occupied, it does take a long time to find a space. And it varies from minute to minute. There's not an average that's useful, but you can look at how it looks over time. And then this shows the probability of finding a parking space during a given minute. So the probability of getting a space plummets when all the parking spaces are full. And then here's the share of traffic cruising for on-street parking. It's ranged from 40 to 60% in midday. That's about half of all the traffic. So can you think of the waste involved in having half of all the moving traffic hunting for a curb parking space? And I suspect that many cities have similar or worse pattern of cruising for parking, but they don't know because it's been hard to do the studies. And most cities trumpet their commitment to avoid global warming, but they haven't taken this simple step to reduce carbon emissions. And it isn't a war on cars or trying to reduce travel, because this is travel people don't want to have. They don't want to be driving around in traffic. They would be avoiding unwanted driving. And I seen that this behavior when there's such a shortage of parking. I've seen people make U-turns in the middle of the street if they see a car on the other side. It's not only illegal, but it's very dangerous. I was using my cell phone yesterday, and I caught this. Before this, that it seems unfair. It seems cruising is so unfair, and that's why it makes you desperate to get a space. Like, here's this video that I took yesterday. The sound isn't working. Well, I was able to interview the driver after she got out of the car. And she told me she does whatever it takes to get a curb parking space in Calgary. Well, it isn't just parking now. There are a lot of different uses for the curb that we have to think about. cars have colonized the curb for so long. We think that, well, that's what the curb space is for. It's for parking. But there are many other uses that we can think of. I mean, just Amazon, before long, could take up all of the curb space. And when you don't have curb space available for these other uses, it leads to double parking. Especially with Uber and Lyft. If there are no places for them to pull over and pick up passengers, or drop them off, they do it in traffic. And it's like having a double parked car in the lane. So not only is it dangerous for the passengers, but it's also bad for all the other drivers. So I think we have to be much more aware of variable use of these curbs at different times. So here is a wonderful image that somebody took in New York of where they have a bike station that took away 3 curb spaces on one side, and there are 3 parked cars on the other side of the street. And just look how many people arrive and leave from the bike station compared to the cars. I think it was 200 people arrived and left from the bike station, and 11 people arrived and left from the parked cars. So which is more productive for the city? Not all bike stations are that active. Remember, this is in the middle of Manhattan. But there are probably, in some cases, more productive uses of the curb. And then to make this even more politically popular, I recommend parking benefit districts, because most people, when they're paying for parking, they have no idea where the money goes. Nobody knows where the money goes. It may be paying for the Iraq War or Afghanistan or given to the UN or something like that. That isn't a very politically compelling use of the revenue for the people who live in the neighborhood. So I think that if we, instead of having the money disappear and making the planners seem like they're just trying to torture us, I think that we can use the money in a way that people understand. Here's a picture outside the Los Angeles Coliseum during the 1984 Olympics. That the residents park their own cars on the street and then rent out their driveways for ticket holders. But it wasn't just during the Olympics campus, it every event at the Coliseum and around most big athletic, arenas in the United States, especially in colleges, college towns, that everybody expects people pay to park at people's driveways and backyards. So some people think, I don't know, Canadians are more civilized than Americans, but many Americans think that charging for curb parking is un-American. Well, I think it's a very American value that people should pay for what they get. That we didn't become a great nation by being a bunch of freeloaders, but we're trying to do that with parking. We're trying to arrange the world so that most people can park free almost everywhere they go. And it hasn't worked out right, I don't think. So in Pasadena, the way they've made the leaders politically popular is that they wanted to revive what had become a commercial skid row. It was a very high-class shopping center through the 1920s, but then when the Depression came, things turned bad, and then during World War II, things got worse. And then after the war ended, everybody was able to get cars, and old Pasadena didn't have much off-street parking. So it continued to decline. And nobody wanted to go there. It's hard to believe because now it's one of the most popular destinations in Southern California. What explained that change? I think it was parking meters with revenue return. It had a big influence on it. The city wanted to put in parking meters, and the merchant said, no way, this is a terrible idea. It'll chase away the few customers we have, because you already had an urban renewal project that tore down parts of the historic city and built parking structures for a new shopping center. Now you want to come in and charge for on-street parking in the historic area. So finally the city said, well, if we put in the meters, we'll dedicate all the money to repairing the sidewalks and the street furniture and the alleys in old Pasadena. And the merchant said, well, that's different. Why didn't you tell us that? Let's run the meters to midnight. Let's run them on Sunday. Because all the money is going to come and fix up our neighborhood. So then they started getting very quickly about $80,000 per block. They rebuilt all of the sidewalks. They tore down all the old sidewalks. They put in new street trees and new with tree grates and street furnitures and things like that. There's a quote from one of the business leaders in the era. She was appointed the head of their advisory board. Is the city's money, but they wanted a local nexus between to the community leaders, and they advise on what's the best use for the money. And it was an easy sell. So here is the sort of pictures of what old Pasadena looked like before. Nothing wrong with motorcycles, but the background on the top right is one of the urban renewal buildings. They tore down most of old Pasadena and put in new buildings. So here is before, and after the city did what only the city can do, which is to do everything to improve the public sphere, like you did on Stevens Street, I suppose would be an example, that you really did everything the city could do to make this an attractive street, and the property owners came through with historic preservation, which is expensive. Previously, it wasn't worth historic preservation because the expenses were the rents didn't justify it. But when the city did what it had to do, what it should do, then the property owners came through. Look at all the street trees, and here's an empty tire warehouse that had been empty for many years and then turned into a department store with no parking. Here are the typical alleys in old Pasadena, with dead animals and mattresses and overhead wires. They cleaned them all up and planted them with street trees, so now they're pedestrian ways. Everybody walks through the alleys. How many people walk through alleys in cities and say, this is great? There are restaurants in the alleys. So here's what has become, and I think that this was a commercial slum 35 years ago. And I think parking meters with revenue return contributed greatly to the remaking old Pasadena. Other cities give free transit passes for everybody who works in the district. The parking meters, when they to persuade the property owners to put in parking meters, they say we'll use all the money to give free transit passes to your employees. And so that's a free fringe benefit that the employers could offer. And do you think Boulder, Colorado does this? Do you think the city would be better off with free curb parking and no transit passes? I don't think so. Galveston gives free Wi-Fi to everybody in the meter district. So there are a lot of things you could do with meter money if it's fine-grained. I know that Calgary does give some meter revenue back, but I think it could be even more if you're more flamboyant about how you use the money and let everybody know where the money is going. So I think these parking benefits districts for people in transportation, I think that they're a transportation management tool because they do a lot of the things that we're trying to do. That they avoid unnecessary travel. But they're also an economic development tool because they make it easier for drivers to park in front of the stores where they want to go. It brings more customers. And I think in Pasadena, the economic development part was more important than the transportation part. That it's important to get the prices right, to get transportation right, but I think that the benefits of rebuilding all the sidewalks and planting all the street trees and having all the historic street lights and street furniture and cleaning up the alleys, that was probably more important. I think that here's something I would recommend Calgary is already doing so many of the things that I recommend, but not a full bore, I think. I think here's some new ways. Give discounts at parking meters for residents of the city. Maybe Calgary isn't touristy enough for this, but it's very important for tourist areas that, say, like Miami Beach, at the meters, you go to a meter, it says $4 an hour, or pay by your app, as most people do now, it's $4 an hour. But if your license plate is registered in Miami Beach, you pay only $1 an hour. So the residents know that the non-residents are paying much less. It's like having a hotel tax. Why do cities have hotel taxes? It's like Monty Python's idea of solving Britain's problem by taxing foreigners living abroad. What could be a better way to get money? And I think that if you had a discount for residents, you could have the market price and give the discount for residents. And you could give discounts for low pollution cars, for cleaner cars, not well washed cars, but low pollution cars, and for shorter cars, which Calgary already does. So I think for residents that there's Miami Beach is a 75% discount for residents. Monterey gives 2 hours of free parking in the public garages. City in England gives free parking at meters. And then you can also just give, well, there's technology. You have to have the right technology, which, of course, Calgary does, and more cities are having, because the license plate is connected to your residence, and it is also connected to the database on what is the length of cars and what is the pollution of the cars. And so they automatically give the discounts to all cars with license plate registered in the city or for anything else. So they can also give these discounts for smaller cars. Here's a graph with links of cars from a 20-foot long Rolls Royce to a less than 10-foot long smart car. Should they pay the same price for parking? Well, I don't think so. You get twice as many cars, smart cars in as Rolls Royces. So I think that the discount for a smart car ought to be about half. And that's just giving you it's just being fair. We're just charging you for what you're using. And of course, if they're smaller, they're more fuel efficient and they have lower carbon emissions. That's an advantage as well. So this is not Photoshop. This is in New York. But I think it's just unreasonable to expect those two cars to pay the same amount for parking on the street. And then these for cleaner cars, some cities are doing this for low hydrocarbon or nitrogen emissions. In Madrid, they charge less for clean cars and 20% more for dirty cars. I don't recommend that pattern. I say it should always be discounts. That you should say that the cleaner your car, the greater your discounts. We're not penalizing anybody. We're just giving discounts. It's a lot more politically popular to give discounts than to have surcharges. And I think it does seem more fair. And Amsterdam is doing the same thing. And I think that London is doing the same thing now, just whether they're diesel cars or not. Because your license plate tells you whether the car is a diesel car or not. That they have records of this. You're being watched. So I think that if you have these discounts, that I had the T2 company say, well, how would this look? And I think, I haven't looked at it for a while, but you see that you say, well, what you would have paid, what is it, $6, I think? But it gives, here are the discounts that you got. If you have a clean car, you get $2 off for that, or $1 off for this, and $1 off for that. But it tells you every time you park, it tells you how much of a discount we're giving you if you're a resident here. That I think this would make good policy more feasible. So I think that that cars have taken up so much of our city for so long for so little price, that they've paid so little for what they have. And it's time to say that, well, we have the technology to make these changes, and we have these new problems. Suppose the money were, I haven't thought about it before, but suppose the meter money were used to clean all the sidewalks in your neighborhood. That is, if your neighborhood, if you pay for market price for parking, or charge for market price in your neighborhood, somebody will come and clean the snow off your sidewalks every morning when needed. You have to ask the neighborhood what they want, and use that as the lever to motivate them to say that, well, yes, I don't want to pay for parking, but I want to charge for parking because I realize it was the way to pay for what we want. And of course, in these very high-rise parts of downtown Calgary, just think of how many residents there are per curb space in front of the building. That how many people would be paying for parking compared to the number of people in the building that are getting all the benefits that are, well, cleaning all the snow off your sidewalk every morning, or giving free Wi-Fi to everybody in the building, or a free transit pass to everybody in the building. The bigger the building, the more difficult it would be to give it free transit pass, but you can certainly clean snow. That doesn't make, everybody benefits from that, or giving free Wi-Fi. Well, what do we do with all the cars we won't need? Here's a suggestion. It's a sculpture in France called long-term parking. I think there's some cars that could be eligible for this. So I think that if you want to, I'm just saying, well, here are some things that maybe you think, do I want this? Do I want to reduce vehicle travel that people don't want to make? They don't want to drive around in congested traffic, staring at taillights, breathing exhaust, and expecting to park free when they find a space. And they certainly don't want to have a lot of congestion and air pollution and energy waste and greenhouse gas emissions. And they do want to improve their neighborhood public services. And they do want to have more housing that's more affordable. And they'd like to do it all quickly. Well, what public policy could do all of this at the same time? Well, I think getting the price of curb parking right will help, and spending the revenue for public services, for local public services, fine-grained public services, that is, if your block has parking meters, your block gets something out of it, and to remove the off-street parking requirements. Well, we can choose between two futures, which is to change nothing and keep curb parking free or cheap. Once you get out of downtown in Calgary, there's an awful lot of free parking everywhere you go. So I think we keep parking free or cheap and require ample off-street parking. Well, we can't change the past. There's no point in lamenting what we did in the past, but we can change the future. So I think that here's one future we can have. And this means that we'll live in a world suggested by this appalling ad that not many people will want to ride public transit. If you can park free at home and at your destination, why would you ever think of public transit? Or bicycles. Now we have electric bicycles. A lot of travel could be by electric bicycles. And we'll have to live with congestion. But I think there's a second future that we can choose, and a better future. And I think it's not that difficult to charge these performance prices. Calgary is better than most cities at demand-based prices. It's one of the first cities to do it, but it's not full bore. I think somebody told me yesterday that when I said we ought to have demand-based prices, and he said that, well, City Hall has, Calgary has City Hall demand for revenue-based prices. That when the money goes to City Hall, who cares? That's not important. That's no reason to change the world, is so that the City Hall will get more money. And if we use the revenue to improve neighborhoods and remove off-street parking programs, I think that would be a better future. And I think that we could expect sort of political support. You can expect it across the political spectrum, regardless of your politics. Because they appeal to a lot of different constituencies. Liberals will see it increases public spending. This is a lot of new money that we could use for public services. And conservatives will see, but this is the market. This is how the market ought to operate. We're relying on the magic of the market to solve our problems. And environmentalists, who are usually the people who put together these events for me to speak in other cities, they'll see it achieve most of their goals. And businesses will see that it unburdens them, that if they don't have minimum parking requirements, the city telling them what they can do and what they can't do, that will be a benefit. The new urbanists who are interested in design will see we can live at high density without being overrun by cars. And libertarians, there are plenty of them, at least in the United States. I don't know if it's impolite to be a libertarian in Canada. But it says people ought to make their own choices. We have property rights advocates who say the government is infringing on our property rights. Well, minimum parking requirements are a huge impingement on your property rights. And developers have a lot to gain. So they will make the choices about how many parking spaces to provide. They're the ones who know how much the parking spaces cost. They're the ones who know what the tenants are willing to pay for. And residents will see that it improves the public services in their neighborhoods. And all the affordable housing advocates who are constantly complaining about how the city is preventing affordable housing. Neighborhood activists will say, well, at least some neighborhood choice. And I think the biggest beneficiaries will be the elected officials who can wash their hands of parking. They won't have to debate whether the price of parking should go up by 25 cents an hour at every parking meter. And they won't have, it won't be the city hall who will be dictating prices. They'll just say, this is what we want to see, and the parking authority will decide. So it gives the parking professionals greater standing in the world. They will have responsibility for more things. Their talents can be used to really improve the world. And then we really can have this. What are we going to do with all the parking structures we built that we won't need? Here's a solution that you wouldn't want to do it in the winter here, but I think Calgary could do this. Well, I think an urban planner can't do anything better to end a lecture than to quote Jane Jacobs. We aren't a wealthy country because of what you and I have done. We live in a wealthy country because we were born here or immigrated here. We owe a lot to the past. And I don't think we're making gifts to the future when it comes to parking. Our parking policies are not making gifts to the futures. Here's a quote from President Eisenhower in his famous farewell address when he warned of the military-industrial complex. And I think President Eisenhower would be horrified to see how we are now plundering the resources of tomorrow for free parking, at a rate that nobody could have imagined. And then our greatest presidential writer in the United States, of course, was Abraham Lincoln. And I think our case is due. The technology has changed so much. The problem has changed so much. I think it's time to think anew about parking, to act anew. Now, you don't often hear a professor of urban planning ending a lecture with quotes from two Republican presidents. But I think that it shows that I think all of our presidents would agree with Eisenhower and Lincoln, and all of your politicians as well, that they would certainly agree with what and with Jane Jacobs, of course, who immigrated into Canada. And I think despite all the institutional inertia in urban planning, reforms are sprouting, and they have sprouted here in Calgary. These paradigm shifts in urban planning are often barely noticeable where they're happening, and afterward it's hard to tell that anything has occurred. But I think we do have terrific policies, unless maybe a lot of this will be necessary unless General Motors succeeds within a new policy it's working on. It's very confidential, but they did give me this video showing what they're working on. Until that happens, I think that we'll have to reform our parking policies. Parking is free for our cars, but housing is expensive for people, and we have our priorities exactly the wrong way around. I think cities have made great mistakes in planning for parking, and you could help correct it. Well, that's about all I know, so I better stop. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. I look forward to hearing some of your comments and questions.
Thank you so much. Don't move. So I'm just going to open it up to questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, you just have to go to the microphone, which is just over there, or I can bring it to you. Just put your hand up, whatever works. And while you think of all your lovely questions, I'm just going to read one that we have from our online audience. So I'm going to read it into the microwave so that everyone can hear it. So the first question is, do you plan to conduct market research asking commuters questions like, if commuters paid market rates for parking, that traffic congestion could be reduced in a few years?
Well, I think the question answers itself. I think if commuters did less solo driving, there would be less traffic. And one policy I would recommend to bring this about is called parking cash out. It's a law in California. It's picking up around the world, I hope, is that many employers generously offer their commuters free parking at work. That is, if they drive to work, the employer will pay for the parking. And in California, the law says that if the employer rents the parking space from a third party to pay for and pays for the commuter's parking, they have to offer the commuter the option to take the cash value of the parking. So that it broadens the offer from free parking or nothing to free parking or the cash value for people who bicycle or carpool or take public transit or live close to work and walk to work. So I think that we can reduce congestion caused by commuters if we reform the parking subsidies. I think it's unfair to tell employees you can have free parking or nothing, because people who are too poor to own a car or who for environmental reasons choose not to use a car, they don't get anything. And it's only the people who drive alone who get the full subsidy. So I think parking cash out is a good idea, and I don't know how it would sell politically in Calgary, but say Washington, D.C. has a law that they're considering right now to require this. But I think if it applies to parking subsidies for commuters that are paid to a third party, the garage owner, that it couldn't be. It's not difficult to offer cash as well. I did studies of employers in California who offer this policy, and everybody thought it was a great idea. They just never thought of it before, that the employers offer this in their trying to recruit new employees. They say, oh, we offer parking cash out, that we offer free parking, but if you don't take the parking, we could give you a free transit pass or money for other forms of commuting. And the potential employees say, well, that's a good idea. And this firm is trying to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. Even the employees, even if they continued driving to work alone, they felt better about the company if they thought the company made this offer, because it's fair and it aligns with the goals that the company says it's trying to achieve. So that's a long answer to the question, but I think that Yes, I think the congestion is largely a peak hour commuting problem, at least in the morning anyway. And I think it's a way that be a way to reduce congestion especially in the morning commute.
Thank you. Go ahead, Bob.
Hi there. Thanks for coming to Calgary. My question is, we have some commercial districts and main streets in Calgary that are reasonably busy, and then they feather out pretty quickly into low-density residential. And in these areas, sometimes people are very proprietary about the parking in front of their own house, and you get these resident-only parking zones that kind of remove that from the public inventory and hems in these business districts. Could you talk about that situation?
Yes, that's a key question about an important issue, and I would recommend what Columbus, Ohio has begun doing. They began charging these demand-based prices in the commercial areas, they're called the short north part of the city, and they have residential permit districts surrounding it. So what they do now is that in the daytime, they allow employees in the district to pay market prices for a permit to park in the permit district, and they spread them all out. So there are no more than 4 of these permits allowed on any block, and they're only allowed on a block unless they're vacant spaces during the daytime. And most people have to, when they drive to work, to pay the mortgage on their house. There are a lot of empty spaces in these permit districts. But you shouldn't just make them free to anybody else. That you have to have an app to pay. Well, you have to either be an employee to buy a permit, a non-resident permit in this district, and all the money goes to pay for public services in the permit district to fix their sidewalks and trim their trees and whatever else they want. And then, so that frees up some employee parking spots in the commercial district. And then they also, with the app, the customers can also pay to park by the hour in the permit district. On blocks where there are available spaces. So they monetize these permit spaces and saying, instead of sort of sterilizing them, saying by residents only, or residents except for 2 hours of free parking to everybody else, which is extremely hard to enforce. So they say that we're going to charge the right price for these spaces in permit districts and spend the revenue in those permit districts. So it just started last year, but other cities have done things like this, especially the idea of selling non-resident permits. So I think that's a good way to help in the area you described.
Thank you. So I have another question online here. So Matt says, hello, Professor Shoup. Do you think that ride sharing, for example, Uber and Lyft, will increase or decrease the demand for parking?
Well, rideshare will decrease the demand for parking. That one of the interesting things with parking cash out is that we found with employers in Southern California, about 17% of all solo drivers gave up took the cash. But most of them shifted to ride sharing. Because if you work for a big company and you're all offered parking cash out, people began looking at each other and said, would you like to ride share? Because they're long trips, from in Southern California. And so some solo drivers shifted to carpooling because they could take the cash and split it. So I think, yes, I think parking cash out and ride sharing will reduce the demand for parking at work.
If you have an audience question, put your hand up so I can come over. Okay, we'll start with you, David.
Thank you. Those of you who know me, my business district is full of vacant private parking stalls on evenings and weekends. So in your experience, have you had any luck in getting over the vacant lot parking only dichotomy with privately run parking structures and spaces?
Yes, I think San Francisco has done the best job of this, is that they had, they own a lot of the public parking supply. I think in Calgary it's only about 15%, something like that, but San Francisco has a lot of parking garages. So for their parking garages, they took the same logic for the garages as they did for the street. And they say, we're going to base it on demand. So they have different prices at different times of day, and they adjust the prices to get an occupancy rate of 80% is ideal. And in the first year, many prices went down because there were so many empty spaces, as you're talking about, that nobody had paid attention to this. They say, what do you do about it? Well, the obvious thing to do about it, because the garages are built to help commerce, to bring customers to businesses. They're not bringing customers to businesses if they're half empty, as they were. So they reduced prices, and the parking structures filled up, and they made more money, because they made more money being almost fully occupied at a low price than half empty at a higher price. And they did other things that improved the world. For the hourly prices, they have something 6 different time periods during the day. They have different prices at different times. But they also reformed, I think, a very bad parking policy that they had, the city had, and many private parking garages have, which is an early bird discount. That if you get in before 10 a.m., you get a discount on the all-day parking price, which means if you drive in during the most congested hours, we're going to give you a parking price break. Now, that's just the opposite of what a city should be doing. So what they did is they eliminated that early bird discount and said that if you drive in before 8 a.m., we'll give you and after 10 a.m., you get a $2 discount on the price. And if you leave before 4 p.m. and after 7 p.m., you get another $2 discount. So you get a discount for leaving and entering at the congested hour, not the opposite, not what was the previous policy of giving you a big subsidy if you drove during the congested hours. So I think if you just extend the idea of trying to get the price right for parking, you'll find there are a lot of ways to subtly nudge the world in the right direction.
Hi, my name's Rebecca. I'm with another business district in Calgary. 2 things. One is we've recently completed a public activation project, which we could not have done without the parking revenue percentage that we received. And what's interesting about that little area where we did the little park activation, which is now a basketball court and chess tables and bike rack is coming, is that in that area there's actually there's free parking there, so there's no short-term paid parking, which there is in most of this the other street or on-street areas in this business area. Now, one of the outcomes is that it's so busy in that area that I'm really with the city pushing for paid short-term parking in that area. So it also increases that capacity to bring in revenues, and also means that you get that business-friendly short-term parking, which is really just to say that it has been a phenomenal program for our little business area, because we don't really have a lot of additional revenues. So that's a great thing. I do have a question about one of the challenges that a number of main streets experience, and not just in Calgary, but I was recently in Halifax and saw exactly the same scenario, which is that bus rapid transit, of course, is in many ways a solution to a lower cost sort of transit for getting people from the suburbs into downtown areas. But one of the outcomes is that on main streets, there's this push and pull between a vibrant pedestrian corridor and a regional transportation corridor. So what happens in our main street is that twice a day on the weekdays, on-street parking is removed for the bus rapid transit, which effectively creates a sort of unpredictability for businesses, and certainly it impacts the pedestrian corridor. and it removes all the capacity for patio extensions, for the kind of parking, the bicycle parking that you had an example of there. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, and if you have had that articulated previously.
Well, those are two questions.
No, the first one was just a comment on the benefits
You
of
mean
that
you have
parking revenue. The second one is a question about the bus rapid transit versus permanent on-street parking. What your
So
thoughts
you
are
have
on
free
that.
curb parking in at the area?
No, it's paid curb
metered
parking.
parking.
Yes, and also one part of that too is that at a certain time of day, you just get a whole bunch of cars being hauled out of that business area at the detriment to those customers.
So the question is really about the bus rapid transit?
Yeah, and what your thoughts are on that in terms of those busy curb-oriented main streets and the impact on those
Well,
business areas.
I should have a prepared answer, but let me wing it. That I think that there is a real conflict between parking and bus lanes, and I think that it wouldn't be unreasonable to ask the Transit Authority to pay for using the bus lanes and using that money to improve the neighborhood. That I think we've become so accustomed to thinking that the curb lane should be free to cars and to buses. But I think probably the BRT serves many more people than the empty cars do. Just I showed you that bike station, that many more people were using the bike station than using the empty cars. I think it would show the same thing with a bus, BRT, that many more people would be benefiting by using that lane in a BRT than there would be from the parked cars. I think merchants also sometimes overestimate the share of their customers that parked in front of their business. I mean, if you ask the people going into a store, did you park in front of this store? Almost everybody would say no. But I think that what they do in California often is to see if you can arrange for parking on the perpendicular streets, replacement parking. That if you can say in a permit district, allow the employees of the firms to park in the neighborhood district, or if you allow the customers to park in the permit district nearby. But I think that merchants often overestimate the importance of a parking space right in front of their business. They think that's so important for them, but usually it's probably for somebody else, and sometimes for employees of the stores. So maybe that's not the answer I would give if I had thought about it for a day or two. But I do think that since so many more people are being served by the BRT, that they could easily pay to compensate the business district to do something that the business district wants to do most with the money. Well, that's about all I know. So I'm kind of worn out. I've enjoyed talking to you, and I hope that maybe I can talk to you, some of you personally afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you again, Donald Shoup, for your insightful lecture. A reminder that this is available online through the registration link, and our team is outside to answer any questions that you may have. Thanks again for joining us today.